In today's tutorial, we are going to be creating a Vox style intro. An intro can be a great way to keep a series consistent, but it can also work really well in establishing the feel of a certain project. Don't forget that you can get the project file on Patreon at patreon.com/Mapal. Now we have quite a process ahead of us, and the process looks a little like this. We're going to start with some ideation and concept because we need to know what direction we're going to go in. The second step is going to be asset collection and creation, where we are going to be creating some of our own textures right behind me. But we're also going to be looking at some different places where we can get assets and make sure that we have everything we need when we go into the design and animation phase. Next step is obviously design, and this one is super important for this type of work where design is at the center point of everything that we are going to be doing. And lastly, we're going to be ending it off with the animation where we can spice it up a little bit, add a little bit of sauce, but luckily that step is going to be pretty simple because of all the pre-work that we are going to be doing. Now before we get into the video, I want to say thank you to this video sponsor Skillshare, but more on that later. Failing to prepare is preparing to fail. That is the mindset I want you to go into these type of animations with. It's easy to get flustered and being led astray during this process because it is quite long and there's a lot of things to keep in mind, but that is exactly why we're doing this process. This first step of concept and ideation can be a bit loosey-goosey, but the things I want you to think about is what kind of story am I trying to tell? What is the vibe that I want to convey? What is the purpose of what we are making? I want you to take those thoughts, write them down on a piece of paper or creating a mood board. Essentially what I want you to do is have it somewhere that you can refer back to later on in the process whenever we start animating and designing, so that we can actually make sure that we're doing the task that we set out to do. In this case, I want to go for an airy, light intro to match the Vox style about a pretend show. The show is going to be about the invention of the light bulb, just because I figured we could find some cool assets on it. For that, I've made a little inspo mood board with a couple of images, assets, and just inspiration that can guide me in the direction that I want to go. I also like adding a couple of notes here and there just to make sure that any interesting thoughts, ideas that I have, I'll write them down so I don't forget them, especially later on when those ideas might come in handy. By already having a pretty good idea of what we're going to be making, we can go ahead and find and create some assets that is going to help us down the line by removing some of those decisions during the creative process, which can sometimes halter or stop that process. When we get into that flow state, we want to just be able to flow, so doing some of the work now saves us some of that. I often get asked what textures I use, what fonts I use, how to add a little bit of that sauce, and we're going to cover some of that today. I'm a big proponent of making your own textures. It's super simple, especially if you have a scanner. You just put whatever you want, scan it, and that's pretty much it. Just add it to whatever project you want to use. You can even go ahead and just use your phone. Since most phone cameras these days are so good, you can just take pictures of whatever it is you need. The same goes for hand-drawn elements like circles, arrows, squares, boxes, whatever you really want. Just draw it on a piece of paper, scan it, or take a photo with it, and that's that. You've got it. The good thing about doing this is your project is going to be unique. It's a one-of-one since it's textures and assets that you've made, you've come up with, and you've used in a very particular way. Now, there are some instances where I don't have immediate access to the textures that I want to be able to use, and in those instances, I like using Texture Fabric or texturelabs.org. They have a bunch of high-quality free assets and super useful in a lot of projects and saves you a little bit of time as well. For fonts, I either use Google Fonts or Adobe Fonts just because they have a lot of different fonts and they're all super easy to use because of the licensing, free, whatever. You can use it for whatever you want, really. In this particular instance, we are going to be using a font from Google Fonts, which is Instrument Serif. Super clean font, really fits the Vox style, and we want to keep that in mind when we pick our assets and fonts and all that good stuff. We are, of course, also going to be needing some photos for our piece. In this case, I'm going to be using pexels.com just because it's free and super high quality. They have photos as well as videos. Some instances where I want more vintage or like retro old school look, I like using something like the Library of Congress, where they have a lot of different things from articles to even old scans of different things. The good thing about it is that most of it is under public domain, which means you can use it for whatever you want, but it's always a good idea to double check that just so you don't get you or your client in trouble. A newcomer to the family is the Met, where they have a open access library, which actually most museums have that, where they take photos and scan everything that they have in the museum and make it free for you to use for whatever you want. Again, you want to make sure that it is in the open access library, but I definitely recommend checking that out as well, just in case you need some old time artifacts and all that good stuff. We've done the groundwork, which is going to pay off in these next couple of steps. Our goal here is to create a few style frame, storyboard type things that will really help us in the animation phase. I have 3 different scenes in mind. I'm going to design them in Photoshop, but you can really do it anywhere. You can do it in Canvas, Illustrator. You can even do it in After Effects if you're more comfortable there. For me personally, I'm going to do it in Photoshop, and to make it really easy on us, I'm going to use the artboard feature, which is going to let us see all the different artboards in one file instead of working with different files. So in this case, I'm going to create a 1920 by 1080 file to keep it nice and easy, and it's also what I'm going to be using in After Effects. If you are going to be working in 4K, you of course want to make a 4K comp in Photoshop, but I'm just going to do 1920 by 1080, and then very important to click the artboards feature, which is essentially just going to let us create an artboard, and then we can just create multiple of them, so we can see all 3 scenes at the same time, so we can make sure that everything is cohesive and looks the way that we want it to. If you aren't super comfortable with designing, you might benefit from today's video sponsor, Skillshare. If you've been following along on the channel, you know that I've been practicing 3D stuff, and I've been taking the learning path called Build 3D Models and Animations in Blender. The learning path has propelled my 3D capabilities extremely fast. One part of that is the structure of it. See, learning paths are made to be taken in a specific order, where you start from absolute beginner, and then they slowly take you through each step of the way to becoming a pro, which makes it super helpful as you start out with, like the one I've been taking, learning how to navigate the program, which is so underrated. Super important in actually becoming pretty efficient. Another part of that is that all the classes are led by industry pros, whether that be from 3D artists to chefs, musicians, graphic designers, pretty much the best of the best for every single industry that you could imagine. And it's no surprise that with a roster like that Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives. So no matter what you are wanting to get into, they most likely have something for you there, whether you're trying to learn more about business and being self-employed, or even if you want to pick up something like knitting or advertising. They have it all, they've got you covered. If you are interested in the Vox style and you aren't super comfortable with designing yet, I'd highly recommend the learning path that's called Graphic Design Basics, Start Exploring and Expressing. It's gonna help you a lot in understanding the basics of design and just improving your design abilities, which is super important when you are doing the Vox style, just because their stuff heavily relies on good design. Luckily for you, the first 500 people to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So get started today, start learning, have fun. With that being said, let's hop into Photoshop, where I have my artboard set up, of course, with all 3 of them. And I think we can just title them real quick by just clicking over here. We can double click, and let's set this to scene 1, scene 2, and scene 3. Now we already have a pretty good idea of what we are going to be making, just because we did all the pre-work, which is exactly why we did it. So the first thing I'm going to do here is create a background color. For this one, I'm going to go for a whitish color, just ever so slightly off-white, just because I think it looks pretty nice. And then we can just take this, copy that, and then just paste it onto the other 2 to keep it all pretty consistent. Now I have a folder here with all the assets that I've gathered, and I'm just gonna start dragging in some stuff, masking stuff out. And I know that this first scene, I want it to be kind of a picture of him standing, and I want it to be kind of a cutout, like a half body cutout type thing. I'm just gonna start by dragging that in, hitting enter, and for everything that I add, I wanna make sure that I turn it into a smart object if it's not already, and you can see that is this little icon down here, indicates that it is a smart object, which just means the resolution is gonna stay intact when we scale in or scale down, which if it isn't, if you scale it down and then scale it back up, you've lost that resolution. And it also just makes it a little bit easier to work non-destructively. And by that I mean we're gonna be using layer masks instead of just deleting stuff of the image. So in this case, we can always try, and I like trying this, I'm gonna hit W to bring up my selection tool, which is over here. And I'm gonna go into the select subject. There's a little arrow. I'm gonna click the down button and change it to cloud. You have to do this every time, but it will give you a better result 9 out of 10 times. And I like doing this just in case it works, because then it saves me a lot of time. But if it doesn't, I usually just go in with the pen tool and mask around. So in this case, absolutely did not work. So that means I'm gonna hit P to bring up my pen tool, which is over here, and I'm gonna stop masking around. And in this instance, I know I just need half body, so I'm just gonna do head, torso, just until like mid body. And for this, I wanna make sure that I am pretty accurate with the tracing, just because we are gonna scale it up a good bit, which means that any ugliness will be enhanced quite a bit. And then once I have completed my mask, I'm gonna right click, and then I'm gonna select make selection, which will just turn it into, well, a selection. And then I'm gonna click this button down here, which is gonna create a mask for us. So now all I'm gonna do here is, since I already know I want this to be pretty big, scaled up, and I'm not too worried about the resolution being kind of off, because it's just gonna add a little bit to that texture, but I wanna make sure that it is pretty big and make sure that hand is also out the way. Kind of like that maybe. I think that looks pretty good. Almost looks like he's supporting himself on the bottom of the edge here. which just works out pretty well. Next thing I want to add to this is I want to take some of these, which are going to be a couple of different light bulbs, and this is a pretty big image here. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take a bunch of these, cut them out, and then we're going to create a radial array later on in After Effects, but I kind of need the cutouts first, so that is exactly what I'm going to do. And in this case, I'm just going to use my quick selection tool, trying to see if it works pretty well, and then we can always go in to select the masks to refine it a little bit, make sure that the edges look pretty nice. So maybe just smoothing it out a little bit, and then add a little bit of contrast to it, hit OK, and then if we mask it, that looks pretty good. And then I can just rename this to light bulb, and then copy that, and then delete the mask, and then we're gonna select another one. And here I'm just gonna go for a few different ones that's gonna be pretty nice and neat. Just picking out the best looking ones, getting a little bit of variation in size. That is pretty much it. I just need like maybe 6, 8-ish. And just like that, we have our cutouts. So I'm gonna select them all, and I'm just gonna hit Command T to scale them all up, just so we can get a good bit of size of them. That is pretty good. And that's the good thing about working with small objects, is that you still get all of that size. Now I'm just gonna make sure that they are all in our composition in here. So we can just take these, drag them in to this scene and this one too. And then if I then click on one, and then I'm gonna right click, and then I'm gonna go to convert to smart object, and that's just gonna make them into a new smart object, but with only the boundary of the actual object itself, which is, well, exactly what we want. So now we can take this and we can just center that up so that it's easier for us to work with. Hit Command A, and then just center them up right in the middle. Next thing I want to add is just couple more detail elements here, and I want to add his name in there somewhere, but I think I want a cooler version of it. So I found this one from a book that was published. I'm gonna take this, I'm gonna drag it in here and hit OK, place that in there, and I'm just gonna scale this up a whole bunch just to be about that size. And then I'm gonna hold Alt while I click the eyeball outside of this layer, which is gonna solo it so it's only the layer that's visible. Then I'm gonna go to Select, and I'm gonna go to Color Range, and then I'm gonna select the black text here, and you can play around with the fuzziness to get exactly the selection that you want. I'm just gonna make sure that it looks pretty good here, and then I'm gonna hit OK, and then I'm gonna create, a layer mask. Now it's gonna remove what we actually want, so I'm gonna hit Command I with the layer mask selected over here. We're just gonna invert that selection. I'm gonna hit B to bring up my brush tool, and I'm just gonna increase the size of my brush a little bit, and I wanna make sure that the color over here is black, and you can switch that by hitting X. And then I'm just gonna paint this in with black because, well, there was still a little bit. And then with it selected, I'm gonna alt click the eye icon again to show it all. And then I'm gonna right click and convert this to a smart object as well. That is pretty good. So we can just leave that there. So now we have all the main elements that we want in there. Now we can move on to scene 2. In this instance, I want to take a different image, and this time I just wanna take a headshot of him. So I'm just gonna drag this in here. And all I want out of this picture is his face. So once that's placed in there, I can just drag it in here. And let's just zoom in a little bit, and then I'm gonna hit W to my quick selection tool and just see if I can just mask his face out a little bit here. And it's not looking super good, but we might be able to work with this and just remove some of that. Don't really need his neck. I just want the face pretty well. And the reason why I'm trying this first with the selection tool is because of the hair. It's just a little bit easier to do with the selection tool. Sometimes it gets that pretty well. But I'm just gonna refine that a little bit, and we can always go in and clean that up. So if you go select the mask and then just hit refine hair, see how that works. You see it gets a good bit of that hair, and then we can hit OK, and then create a layer mask. Now I wanna clean this up a little bit, so I'm gonna hit B to bring up my brush tool, scale this down a little bit, and I'm gonna remove that, and then I'm gonna change it over to white, and maybe just fill in just a little bit around the face a little bit, so it looks a little bit more natural here. And this is also one of the benefits of working non-destructively, is that you can go in and really fine tune your selections. And then I'm just gonna hit Command T to scale it up, and I'm scale it up a good bit so we have it. And so we can really see what it is that we've got going on here. And I think that's pretty fine. If you ever need a little bit extra quality, you can always go into filter and then neural filters, and then see if the upscaling works. Sometimes you get really good results, sometimes you don't. And that worked okay. So if we remove the background and just go back and forth, you can see it does make it just a little bit crisper. Not sure it's entirely worth it. There might be some better upscaling, but for now, we'll just keep this in here because it looks just fine. Now we can start adding just a little bit of extra stuff that we wanted to add in there. And in this case, I do know that I want to change some of it or maybe turn it into shape elements in After Effects, but this is going to help with the layout just a little bit. So I'm going to select my rectangle tool down here, and you can just click and hold to change which one you want. And I'm just going to drag a couple shapes here and get a little bit of a layout going. And I want to drag that below. And of course, we want to keep the colors in mind that we created in the mood board or that we made in the beginning. Let's make this one a nice reddish color. Maybe something like that. Looks pretty sharp, gives some nice contrast. And maybe we'll create another shape layer. And this time we'll just drag it out a little bit like that, maybe up here. And we can change this to be maybe a nice yellow color. Might look pretty good. Maybe layer that in front just to add a little bit of depth in there. This one I'm definitely going to create in After Effects just so we can mess around with it a little bit more. But I want to take the ellipse tool and just create a little bit of a speech bubble look, just so I know kind of where I want to place it. And this one is going to be more of like an idea bubble. And then we can take one of our assets from in here. We have this SVG in here that I'm going to drag in. And that'll serve as our little icon thing that we're going to put in there. And I'm just going to hit M to select the other two, and then create a mask, hit Command I to invert it, and then we can place that wherever we want, just so we have a general idea of what it's going to look like in After Effects to make it really easy on us. And then the last thing I want to add to this is his signature, which I just thought looked super sick. And there's a couple different ones. I might do this one just because this one goes into a whole bunch of the text. So this one is going to be a little bit easier to extract. So placing that in there, and let's just hit enter on that, and then let's crop that out. Boom. And we can scale this up a good bit. The magic of smart objects. And then I'm going to alt click the eye again to solo this. Go to select and color range, and let's pick white this time. And let's just play around with this until we get something that is pretty good. Maybe something like that. And then hit Command I to invert it. And we, of course, don't want all of the rest of that stuff. So I'm just going to hit M to bring up my marquee tool. And then Shift Command I to invert the selection. And make sure white black is in the background. And then Command Delete to delete everything but that. And then Alt click the eye to show everything again. Last scene is our final title scene. The only thing I want to do here is I actually want to keep it pretty simple. I want to use a couple of the different texts like the story of Thomas Edison, and then I want this text that is this one, the electric light. Those are the two texts I want in there, and I want to switch between the two texts, which is going to be a super simple animation, but I think it'll look pretty sweet. In this case, let's hit Command L to bring up the levels for this, and I just want to increase the contrast of it just a little bit, just so it's going to be a little bit easier for our selection tool because there is some of that gold in there. And then we can go into select, color range, and make sure that the black is selected, just like that. And then create a layer mask. And then we can just simply hit M to bring up the marquee tool, mask around the text that we have, and then hit Shift Command I to select it. Make sure black is in the background over here, so X to switch between them, Command Delete, and we have that text in there. And we can re-show all that, turn this into a smart object, and just make sure we have that centered right in the middle. And then we can take the second text, which is right here, let's drag that in, and pretty much the same thing that we're gonna do here, and just hit Command L to bring in a little bit more contrast in there, just so it's gonna be easier for our selection tool to pick it up. And we'll click the icon, and then go to select, color range, make sure the black is selected. Might play around with the fuzziness just a little bit, and hit OK, and mask that sucker out, and M to bring up selection tool, Shift Command I, you know the deal, bada bing, bada boom, and back, and then we can center that up too, so that it is nice and centered. And I just think these fonts look super sick, and they just have a lot more character than anything that you just find on a regular font site. If it was just this frame, it would be just a little bit boring. What I think might be a lot of fun is have a little bit of a frame. So I'm gonna hit U to bring up my shape tool. I'm just gonna hit Shift U to shift between them until I get to the square. And I'm just gonna draw out a square here, or well, a rectangle to be exact. And I wanna center that bad boy up. So hit V, center that up, and place it below. And let's just change the color to our background color. So that is F3, F3, F3. And then I'm gonna duplicate it, move it behind, hit Command T, and I'm just gonna scale it up to fit the entire background here. And I wanna change the color to, let's say maybe yellow. That'll work for now, but it's just gonna serve as our guide for this because ideally what I'd like to do is kind of create a frame of other pictures around it. So we'll split up this into a couple more. I just want to make sure that I kind of get the sizing right of this. We can always hit U and then draw out a little square that is different color from everything else. Hit Command T and then scale it up to fit so that it lines up with the top and the bottom. And then we can duplicate it and make sure that our scale is right. So in this case, we gotta make it, extend it just a little bit, and that just makes sure that we have even spacing on all the sides. But I think that looks pretty good for the design. Now, before we can actually hop into After Effects, there's just one last thing that we need to do, and that is, of course, export these into individual PSD files that we can use. To do that, we're just gonna go to File, and then we're gonna go to Export, and then Artboards to Files. It's really that simple. You can pick exactly where you want it to be. The prefix, which is what comes before, I'm just gonna do artboards underscore, and then it's gonna be named scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, yada, yada, yada. Gonna hit run, and it's gonna do its thing, do all the little, and then, boom, we have PSD files. And now we can hop into After Effects, and I'm gonna open my folder window. So now I'm gonna drag in the first scene, and I'm gonna hit OK, and that'll create a little pre-comp with all of it in there. And I'm just gonna take this pre-comp and actually copy it in the main, and delete this one just because we don't need that many redundant pre-comps. And I'm going to drag these two into our assets folder just to keep it a little bit more organized. And I'm going to do that with the second scene and the third scene as well. Now we've got our little layer set up here, 1, 2, and 3, and we can start animating. The good thing about this is that the Vox style is super simple, so we're not going to have to do too much to it. We're just going to add a little bit of movements. They use a lot of match cuts and just slight positions and scales and zooms and whatnot, but it's super, super simple, but really textured and saucy, where we're gonna have a lot of fun, obviously. The first thing I wanna do is actually create the little radial thing that I was talking about with the light bulbs. So I'm just gonna select the light bulbs here, and let's change the color of them to a red, just so we can differentiate, and then I'm gonna solo them. I'm gonna scale them down, so I'm gonna hit S to bring up the scale them down to a pretty good size, and then I'm gonna hit A to bring up the anchor point. And in this case, I'm just gonna slide it until it goes up a little bit, right about here, I think looks pretty good. And that's just gonna keep the anchor point here, so that if we rotate it, you can see it rotates around that, and that's just gonna give us a nice radial. And I might even hit A again and just up it just a little bit more. And you can always scale it up too if you want it to be a little bit bigger. Then what we're gonna do here is, if I hit R on all of them to bring up the rotation, I'm gonna take the rotation of each of them and link it to the rotation below. And we're just gonna create a little rotation train, I guess you can almost sort of call it. And then we're also gonna take the entire parameter, so parent the whole layer to the other layer, and just like that. And now if I rotate this, you can see we get a nice radial. And then we can take this and let's unsolo that and pre-comp it by hitting Shift Command C and just name this bulb radial array pre. And we'll click this little rasterize, continuously rasterize button just so we still get the edges of everything, because if we don't, well, it cuts it off. So that is very important. But then we can hit R on this and we can just add a little bit of rotation animation. And I'm actually gonna place this behind this guy, and we can always play around with the scale so we can actually see kind of what's going on for what we're gonna do here. So let's add a little bit of position animation to him, and I just want him to slide in. So let's go to about 12 frames, keyframe his position, and just move him out to the side a little bit while holding Shift so he stays locked in position. And then we can select these keyframes. If you hit F9, then you can go in and add some easing to it. And in this case, I want to take this one and move it all the way to the left. And I want to take the left one and move it all the way to the left as well, so that it comes in really fast and then slows down. So we get a nice instant little motion. If you are interested, you can always use Flow to get this. I have presets that you can get on Patreon as well that have this included to make it super easy on you, because you are going to be using a lot of the same keyframe stuff, so it's pretty nice to have. But just space it out a little bit, we get a nice little animation here. And what we can do here is, for this, I'm just going to select all of these, and then I'm going to use Motion Tools, which is a free plugin, and I'm just going to offset them a little bit so they come in one by one. And let's do 3 frames. And I'm just going to move it that way. So now we have this little boom, boom, boom. And just to spice that up a little bit more, we're gonna add some rotation to it. So if I hit R, I'm gonna keyframe the rotation, maybe tilt it back a little bit so it starts over this way, and go forward to about 1 second. And then we can keyframe that forward a little bit to, let's put that to 0. And we can add the same type of easing as before, just this time with Flow. You can see it's the same thing. And then I'm playing that back. We now have a nice little animation here. And I think what I want to do here is actually move this guy over just a little bit, maybe scale these back down to 100 so that they come in, and then he comes in, but we might slow it down just a little bit more, just so we get a little bit of layered animation here. So we have him come in here, and then he slides in, and we want to just add a little bit more rotation to this. We're going to alt-click the rotation over here, and I'm going to add an expression. I'm just going to do time times 10, which is going to add a continuous rotation to the animation in the background, maybe even just a little bit more, just so we get a little bit more of time to see this radial array type of thing. And then we can have this text come in, but we might want to add a little bit of a text box to it, scale this bad boy down a little bit too. Place it over here maybe, might even scale that up just a little bit more, just so it's not super tiny. Add a text box to it. Just gonna click and drag to create a nice little box here. Change the fill to a solid color. Place it below. Might center this up just so we make sure that it is actually aligned to the text type of thing as such, and change the color of this to be maybe a yellowish color here. Something like that I think looks pretty sweet. And I'm just going to select this layer and search for size and just change it up a little bit just to get the spacing a little bit nicer, a little bit more even. And then we can take these and let's move them over this way. So now we have this text as well come in, and we're just going to add a little bit of animation to that. And I'm going to select these two, and then I'm going to hit Alt and bracket to just trim them a little bit. And I'm going to hit P, and then I'm going to keyframe the position and move those keyframes forward a little bit. And I'm just going to move this over to the side to match the movement of the guy here as well. And then we can select these keyframes, add the same type of easing. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the shape layer as a track map for the text. And then I'm going to show that just so it's always in there. But then I'm going to stagger it a little bit. So I'm going to move the text back just a little bit, so we get a little bit of like an extra layer of movement in there, which I just think looks super nice. Then I think there's one thing I just want to add. If I take this right here and I just hit Shift Command D to split the layer, I want to scale this first one up a good bit, just so we get a little bit more detail element in there. Just really get a close-up look at these bulbs, kind of like boom. And then all I want to do here is on my first layer, I'm going to hit S to bring up the scale, and the same on the second one. I'm going to keyframe both of them, and I'm going to take this top one, move it up forward. I'm just going to go a couple frames forward, and then I want to zoom out of this one and move that to match with that one. I'm going to go forward to the second layer and just scale this one up a little bit and move it so that the keyframes are lined up. I'm going to select both of them, or well, all of them, and I'm going to use sexy speed. I'm going to apply that so that the easing is the same, and then it's just slow and then fast, so we get just a little bit of a zoom out motion to get a little bit of context between the zooms, which just helps sell it just a little bit more in terms of this. And we might even move this over just a little bit more, just like that. And I might take the guy a couple more frames just so everything is layered just a little bit. And it's just about playing around with the timing of everything. We can add a couple more detail elements. I do have some scans that I made. If I go into my textures, I have this nice hand-drawn element type of thing here. And I might just take some of these scribbles here, maybe take this light bulb, and in this case, I'm just gonna add a color key. And I'm also going to add a levels to just increase the contrast of it a little bit. And move that in just so we get nice black and white type of values. And then with the color key, I'm just going to select white and increase the color tolerance a good bit. And we can add a fill to it and change that to a black color. And I'm going to hit Y to bring the anchor point up. And I'm just going to move this to be around my little light bulb to make it a little bit easier on us. Hit R. Bring up the rotation. I'm just going to rotate this around maybe a little bit like that. Move it up here. Move it in the background. And then I'm just going to hit the T to bring up the opacity. Crank it down a whole bunch and play around with this a little bit until we get a look that looks pretty good for us. Maybe really, really faint, something like that. We can always add a little keyframe to the scale. So at the very beginning, let's keyframe the scale right there. And I'm just going to move that keyframe over to the end and then just increase it just a little bit, so that it just has a tiny bit of movement to it that's super, super subtle. And I'm just going to keep this linear because we don't need it to be anything fancy. It's just a slight detail element, really. We are already going to start adding just a little bit of source wherever we can. So to the shape layer itself, I'm going to add a turbulent displace. And in this case, I'm going to set the amount to 30 and the size to 2. And that's just going to give us a slight, kind of looks like a hand-drawn look almost, to it, which just helps sell it a little bit more, just gives it some character. And then I'm going to open the evolution options, go to random seed and alt click it. And then down here, I'm going to do a posterize time 6 and then add a random effect, which is then just going to cycle it. I'm just going to do super high number there. That'll just keep cycling the randomness of it, so we get a nice jittery look. The good thing about that is we can reuse it over and over again. You can even take the effect, if I click here, and then duplicate it, and then set the amount to 8 and the size to 8 as well, just so you get a little bit more variation in there. So you have one small and one large, and I typically like to take the large and put it first. So we can just name this rough large and rough small. And we can take both of these and copy them and then paste it onto our little hand-drawn element as well, just for a little extra flair in there. But going back into the main composition here, now if I hide the first two, we can see we have this first one come in, boom, that looks pretty good. And right here, we might want to cut out to the next scene. So I'm going to show that and then put that right in there. And then I'm going to double click this to go into it, and we can start animating this one. So I'm going to start by just creating my rectangle up here, and then I'm just going to make it pretty much the same thing as this one, just make it nice and easy. And then we can hide this one and select whichever layer this is, which will be this one, delete that, and then hit Q to go up to your shape tool again and change the color to match the red color, and then just draw out your square here as well, something like that, and delete that one and put it below there. So now we have our little shapes here, just like we wanted. And then I think the signature is actually pretty good, and the light bulb we are definitely going to change. So let's change that to signature, keep that nice, and I'm going to delete that, and that. And then I'm going to go into my shape tool, and I'm going to go to the star tool, and I'm going to draw out a star, but we can change it pretty easily. But first I need to size it pretty good. And let's open up the parameters here and go to polystop path. And then we want to change the roundness and the rotation of it so that we can get a nice kind of a speech bubble look here. We just want it to be pretty puffy. I'm just going to search up the scale of this thing so that we can scale it properly, because I want it to be a little bit shorter and wider than that. That looks pretty good. And I think I actually might just do like a dark grayish color here. We can duplicate that and just scale that down a little bit. So we get a couple of different ones here. Boom, kind of like an idea cloud. And I think that works pretty well. And then I'm just going to take this light bulb from Illustrator, the SVG file, so that it's actually, you know, scalable, and use Overlord to send it into After Effects. And then we can just make sure that anchor point is centered up, and then we can scale it down to fit inside our little thinking cloud here. And we will just add just a little bit of text to this and a little bit of animation. So for the animation, I just want to hit R to bring up the rotation. I'm going to alt click the rotation, and I'm just going to add a wiggle expression to this. And I'm just going to do wiggle 1,10, which is just going to give it a little bit of rotation there. Super neat. And then we're going to add some text. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be using instrument serif throughout this project. So that is what I'll be using as well. But I'm just going to type in light bulb here, and then we can change the font to instrument serif regular. Maybe scale that down just a little bit and place that right there. And we can always change the color of this to be F3, 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 just to match everything. Same with the text, make sure that color is the same. Move that over to be centered up pretty good, and that looks pretty neat. I might change the color of this a little bit just to give it a little bit more contrast, because it's looking a little weak sauce right now. Maybe we'll do that in a nice bluish color just to give it a little bit of extra spice. For this, I want to keep it pretty simple, but I also want to keep the previous scene in mind. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this shape layer, and I'm going to hit P, and we know that we're changing at around the 2-second mark. So what I'm going to do here in this first scene is right around here. I'm going to keyframe it at the 2-second mark and go about 12 frames. And I'm going to move that over to the right, and I'm just going to keyframe that with other version of the super sexy out speed. And that's just starting slow and then picking up the pace so that it kind of whoomp. And I just think that looks super cool pretty usually. And we're going to do the same with him as well. So in this case, just move that over a little bit, keyframe that, and go about a little bit off the boom, keyframe that out the way, and change the easing of that so that now we have a couple of movements going that way, and we can use that to drive into the next scene. If we just move that over a little bit, let's do a couple more frames right there. Boom. So going into this one, let's take this, hit P, and then I'm gonna keyframe that, go to the beginning, and just move that over to the left. Then we can add the end version of it. And especially because they are the same color and roughly the same shape, it's gonna help create a little bit of a match cut in terms of the shape itself. You can see it just helps sell the movement just a little bit more, even though they aren't really related at all. And then let's take this other shape layer. What I'm gonna do here is just also add just a little bit of movement here, but I'm just gonna stagger it just a little bit. I'm gonna keyframe that, and I'm gonna take it from the same direction and add the same easing, but then I'll just move it just a little bit. So it comes in a little bit after. Might even slow it down just a tiny bit there, but I think that looks pretty sweet. His face, I wanna do a similar animation that I did to the light bulb. So I'm just gonna be taking that, just rename this face, and I'm gonna hit R, and then we can open up the rotation of this one, and we can right click it and copy expression only, and we can paste it onto that rotation as well, and that'll just give us a little bit rotation in the face there as well. But we might change it just a little bit to be a 0.5, so just a 0.5, and then do a 5 instead. So it's just a little bit more subtle, but just has a tiny bit of movement in it. And we can add a little bit of that same animation too to animate it in. Just keyframe that, go to the beginning and move it out a little bit, and add that in speed, just like that. So now we get a nice little animation here. For the signature, we are gonna place that at the very top, and I'm gonna hit G to bring up my pen tool, and I'm gonna remove the fill, and then I'm gonna add a stroke to it, just some color that will be easy to recognize, like a green. And I'm just gonna mark this over like that, just so we get a little bit of like a drawing look. And I'm gonna increase the width until it covers the full text. And then we're gonna add a trim paths to it. Go into trim paths, and then we are just gonna animate this real quick. So keyframe the end for 100, move it forward a little bit, and then set it to 0. So now we have this little drawing type of look. And then we're gonna add a roughen edges to this, and we're gonna make it look like a brush stroke to use it as a reveal. So we're gonna take the complexity all the way up. Let's decrease the scale a little bit, and then increase the stretch, increase the border so we get some of that nice texture in there. And then all we're gonna do here is hit U to only show the keyframes. Signature, use that as a track map. We can just name this mask. Boom. So now we have it kind of reveal, you get a little bit of that texture in there, you can kind of tell, which just looks super, super sweet. You can always add some easing to this, but I think this looks pretty fine actually, just as it is. So we've got that in there, and I might even just add a fill to this just because I see a little bit of white there, and I'm just gonna make this black, just so we get some nice juicy oozy in there. Looks pretty goosey. And then for this little bulb up here, the way we're gonna animate that is just a simple scale animation. So I'm gonna select these two, hit S, go to about 12 frames, keyframe the scale of both of them, then go to 0 and set both of them to 0. And you can just add a little bit of sexy speed perhaps. So now we just get a little scale animation, and then we of course want the smaller one to come first and then the larger one to come second. And then with these two, use that as a track map, bada bing, bada boom, then show that so that as it scales up, we get that. And just add a position animation to this as well, keyframe the position, go back a little bit, and just move them down ever so slightly, and use the sexy in speed to get a nice looking little animation here, just so we get a little bit of movement as it comes up, which just adds to the dynamicism. Of course, stagger it just a little bit, you know, we don't want to be boring, so just have one come in before the other, just to make it look saucy, you get me? But that is pretty much it for the main animations that I have in mind here. Might even take these and just stagger them just a little bit more so that we get one and then the other come in, but that looks pretty sweet. One thing I do think would work pretty well in this specific one is actually turning it into a little bit of a 3D space. So what we can do here is, the main thing I want to do is just group everything up into the groups. So signature is going to be one layer, and I'm just going to name this Sig Pre, and we want to make sure that it doesn't look too messy out here, just drag it wherever we need to, but I mean, we can always organize that later on as well. And then the light bulb with the shape layers and the face and that shape layer will go into face pre, and that is pretty much the main two things that I want. I'm gonna right click, go to new, and then I'm gonna add a camera. And I'm just gonna select a 50mm camera, the standard, but I'm gonna change the f-stop to something like 0.9, and then I'm gonna turn these two layers into 3D layers by clicking down here, and I'm gonna make sure that Classic 3D is selected. You can always hit Command K, go into 3D renderer and change it in there. But now we can take the signature and let's just open 2 view mode actually so we can see what we're doing. We can take the signature, move it out front a little bit, take this guy, move him out back a little bit, and then we can go into the camera, open it up, go into camera options, make sure that the focus distance is on the very back, which is where his face is. We're just gonna blur this a little bit, and we're just gonna increase the aperture until the signature is pretty out of focus, and this is gonna look pretty sick. And then once it comes in a little bit, we've got that, and then I'm gonna keyframe the focus distance, and I'm gonna go forward a little bit, and then I'm gonna move it up to be on our signature so that the background is blurred. Move forward a little bit again, keyframe that, and then go forward, and then change it. Just copy that first one, and then select all of those, and then go to sexy speed, apply that because, well, it is sexy. And just like that, we have a nice little like focus shift kind of looking thing. And the only thing that's left to do for this scene, at least as of right now, is going into the first scene and copying our little roughen edges type of look here. Copy that, and then we are gonna apply it to our shape layers. So all of these shape layers are gonna get that nice sexy treatment to give it just a little bit of character. And you can even apply it to the signature as well, just to spice it up a little bit. You get what I'm saying? Just makes it look a little bit cooler. So now we have this first scene, and then boom, switches over to the second one, which looks pretty cool. We get a nice little focus shift. I need to extend this comp to be about 10 seconds just to give us something to work with here. And then we're gonna move this over right about here. We can start the last scene, which is gonna be our title scene. Luckily, this one is gonna be pretty straightforward. I'm gonna take these and I'm gonna hit P on both of them. I'm gonna go to 12 frames, keyframe both of them, and then I'm gonna go back and I'm just gonna move them down, and I'm gonna add my sexy in speed, just like that. All I'm gonna do here is move forward a little bit and then have the second one come in a little bit later. And as this one comes in, I just need this one to animate out. We're gonna keyframe that and then move it up like that. And I'm just gonna add sexy speed to this one. And then I wanna make sure that that is right at its peak. Go 1 frame back and then Alt and right bracket to cut that out. So now we have a nice little transition there. Super simple match cut type of transition, just to keep it nice and simple. Now the fun thing that we're gonna do with this one is just adding a couple of drawn out type of elements. So I'm gonna hit G to bring up my pen tool, and I'm gonna decrease the stroke to something like 3, and then change it to, let's do maybe a red color would work pretty well for this maybe. And then for this first one, I'm just gonna click and I'm gonna start drawing a circle type of looking thing, kind of like we're circling a piece of text or something like that. And then we can place that right over here. Maybe rotate it just a little bit like that. Make sure the anchor point is right in the middle. And then we can add a trim pulse to this just to give it a little bit of animation. And we're just gonna change this to add a trim pulse. Open that up, keyframe the end a little bit forward, and then set that to 0. And let's zoom out a little bit and add some slow sexy speed to this one and see how that looks. That is pretty sweet. And I might even do it so that it happens right as it kind of changes, just to add a little bit more motion to the ocean type thing. Add a little bit of those hand-drawn elements that I had before. So if I go into assets, add in my hand-drawn thing. Let's see what we've got here. If I rotate this a little bit, 90 degrees, and then scale that sucker down, we can actually see what we've got going on. I think maybe some of these arrows could be pretty cool having in here. So let's place that right there. And I'm just gonna add a color key to this, and let's select that and just increase that until we don't see that. Add a fill, make sure it is set to black. Well, set it to whatever color you want, and then hit Q, or go into a rectangle tool, and then we're just gonna mask this out so that it's only that one that we are seeing. And we'll just let this one be stationary on there. We don't need it to do something fancy. We can duplicate this, hit M to show the mask, delete the mask, and maybe let's add a little bit of a frame down here too. And again, just select your rectangle tool and you can mask that sucker out. And I just think that looks pretty cool, just giving it a little bit of a detail element in the corner, just for some visual interest. Now, the only thing I want to work on in this is just adding some pictures to the background here. And all I'm going to do is take some of these pictures that I've found online, and I'm just going to place them around the border right in front of it, like that. Maybe You've got his eyes up here. I think that looks pretty cool. So we can take that and just mask this out, kind of like that. And then we can add another one. I think that looks pretty good. And I'm just gonna take this rectangle and place it above all the pictures. And I'm just gonna change the color of it by adding a fill and changing it to black. And make sure it's placed above everything. Hit T just to decrease the opacity of it just a little bit. So just adding a little bit less focus on that. But that is pretty much it for our last scene here. So now we have this little sequence here that already flows pretty well for what it is. We haven't done too much to it, but it's time to add the extra spice, the extra layer of sauce that's really gonna tie it all in. One thing I did forget is just taking this roughen thing, copying that, and then putting it onto our elements in this scene as well, because we definitely should do that, and the same with the text here as well, just to add it in there. But what I'm gonna start with here is just adding the movement between the scenes. So for this first one, we already have a nice little movement coming in. We have a nice little bit of zoom. For the second one, I wanna add just a little bit more motion to it. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a transform, and then we are gonna keyframe the scale. I'm gonna hit U so I can see it. I'm gonna go forward a little bit and just set that to something like 105. And then I'm just gonna take these two and I hit P to open up the keyframes for the position. Let's just set that up right there. Move this one forward a little bit, move this one back a little bit. So with this one, let's move it to the left a little bit, just ever so slightly, a couple pixels. Move this one to the right a little bit. And then we can just line these keyframes up with one another and add sexy speed. And I actually want to take the background of this. So I'm just going to take the background, remove that, and just paste it into our main comp. So it's just one background for everything, which just makes it a little bit easier for us to move between stuff without getting some hard edges. Already there, we just get a little bit more movement, and I'm just going to line these keyframes up and also add sexy speed to those, just so we get a little bit more movement in here. We want to make sure, of course, that we cut that up so that we don't get any weird overlapping. I think this scene in and of itself is pretty good, and we just need to transition from this to that. So for this one, I'm actually gonna scale it up to start a lot bigger than what it is, right about here. And let's keyframe it at right about here, the scale, and then move back a little bit. Take this keyframe and go forward a little bit, and then just zoom out to be 100% to the actual size that it is. And you can select these two and just add some sexy speed to that, just so it kind of zooms out a little bit and reveals that nice sexiness that we made around it. But before that, I actually want to do a little bit of a scale from this one to that one. So I'm going to take the transform adjustment layer here, do we did the zoom on, and then I'm just going to keyframe the scale. I'm going to move forward and just set the scale to something like 110 and make sure that we apply sexy speed again to this one, just so we have a nice little bit of additional movement from one scene to another. It's gonna go in, and then as this comes in, it's gonna zoom out. But I wanna start that just right about here where we start getting a little bit of movement, just so it's not super boring and stagnant. But I think that looks pretty sweet for like going between the two. And we might even take this one and just scale it out a little bit more, because I know we have more room to work with. And I think that looks pretty good. Now we can add a little bit of the spicy spice. So we're gonna add another adjustment layer, and I'm gonna rename this to adjustment and posterize time. And obviously I'm gonna add posterized time to this bad boy. That is also a classic of the box style, and it just somehow it just helps tie everything together because it makes it feel a lot more tactile and a lot more, it just gives it a lot of character. Below that, we're gonna add a solid, and we're gonna name this grain, and we're gonna change the color to 80-80-80, which is 50% gray. And we're gonna add the add grain effect. We're going to change the viewing mode to final output, the preset to Codec Vision 800T, size to 1.3, softness to 1.3, and we're going to add a tint, very important to get a good look. We're going to pre-comp this and name this grain 3, and very important to move all attributes into the new composition, and we can change the blending mode to overlay. And that is just going to give us a little bit more texture in there, a little bit more tactility. We did have a good few textures that I've scanned myself actually, and I want to use some of those because they are super sick. The first one is going to be a plain paper, and I'm just going to drag that in there and then put it below the grain, and then I'm just going to hide all of this, and I'm just going to hold shift while clicking minus or plus to cycle between the blending modes until we get one that looks pretty sweet. And here I'm just trying to see what gives us some pretty good characteristics and the colors that we have. So I think multiply looks pretty good, and you can see we get some really nice texture in all the assets that we kind of have, which just helps give it just a little bit more life. You can always add a levels to your textures as well and play around and see how much texture you can actually push out of these assets. For something like this specific scene, I might want to add a little bit of texture to a different texture to the shapes themselves. So if I go into the face pre and then open up my texture folders, I might do something like the cardboard one and drag that in. And then for my bottom shape layer, I'm just going to use that as a track matte for it. And you can still show it. And I'm going to add a tint effect so that it's just black and white. And I'm going to shift through the blending modes until we get something that looks pretty cool. Just has a little bit of texture in there, just spices it up ever so slightly. Just adds a little bit of texture to it, but I might just add a levels to this bad boy and just increase the brightness of it just a little bit, just so it's not as punchy. And then I'm just gonna duplicate this and place it on top of that and link it to that, just so we get a nice little bit of texture in that as well. Just gonna help it bring it all a little bit together, add some more flavor to it. We can also add some particles, which is always a great way to add a little bit of extra source. We're gonna add another solid, and we're just gonna name this particles. And we're gonna add a fractal noise layer to this one. And in this case, we are gonna open the transform and we're gonna scale this down a good bit. And then we can play around with the contrast and the brightness until we just get tiny little specks in there, and just play around with this until you get a look that you want. And then we're gonna go into the evolution options and alt click the random seed. Again, do something like a posterized times 6 and add a random and just set that value super high so there's lots of randomness going to it. And then you can just change the blending mode to something like add, and then you just get a couple of particles in there and you can play around with it more until you get a look that kind of suits you. We're gonna drag that below the posterized time so that it kind of gets double affected. Then we are gonna add another little extra layer of spice and movement in there, and we're gonna do that right above our zoom layer. So I'm gonna hit Shift Command Y to add an adjustment layer, and then we're gonna add a transform effect to this, and we are gonna set the scale to 1:1, alt click the position, add a posterized time, let's do 6, and then we're gonna add a wiggle 222,2 just to keep it nice and simple. And that's just gonna add just a little bit of that wiggle in there to help bring it just a little bit more to life and spice it up. And this is at the point where you've got most of your stuff down, you've got most of the motion down, you've got your main assets, and you can really start playing around with a little bit of the timing, adjusting a couple of things. Like this scene, for example, I might want to go in and actually change the color of the bulbs. So if I open that up, I'm going to add an adjustment layer and just add a hue saturation and just decrease the saturation. And then I'm going to add a levels to just increase the contrast of them just a little bit to make it look a little bit more like it fits with the color theme of everything. And you can see already there how much that changes the look of it. And this is the fun part about making these types of animations, is that you can customize it a lot. It's super simple in terms of the movement and animations you add to them, but you can do a lot with the colors, assets, and textures that you end up using in order to create a pretty complete piece. Anyways, that's pretty much it for this week's video. Just a, well, not so little tutorial on how you can create a Vox style intro, or pretty much any intro you want in a Vox style, and just thinking more about the design that you do. If you are subscribed to the Patreon, you'll obviously get all these assets along with everything that I made for this in terms of like the textures and all that, super high res textures that you can get. And I just want to say again, thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Make sure you take advantage of that 1 free month because you can learn so much stuff. They have so many different things on there. But yeah, I just want to say thank you, and I'll see you again in the next video. Peace out.